A glove sits in a bowling bag. It looks like a piece of protective equipment. In one building, it is legal. In another building 1 mile away, wearing it can end your tournament. The object at the center of this story is not a bowling ball. It is a category of rigid wrist supports designed to hold a bowler's hand in a fixed position through the release. Companies including KR Strikeforce and Robbie's Revs have sold versions of this equipment for years. The same physical object, 2 different rule books. Same week, different outcome. The public explanation is competitive fairness. The paper trail raises a different question. If this equipment compromises competition, why is it still permitted almost everywhere else it could be worn? Start with the device itself, because the device is where the institutional story begins. Manufacturers built these supports to do one thing: reduce variability in a bowler's release. Marketing copy from these companies talks about repeatability. It talks about consistency. It talks about preserving axis rotation through the swing. These are not vague claims about comfort. They are specific, measurable claims about performance. Some versions use molded plastic. Some use steel. The materials are chosen because they restrict wrist movement more effectively than fabric or tape ever could. A flexible support flexes. A rigid one does not. That distinction is the entire basis for everything that follows. A product built to reduce human variation in an athletic motion raises an old question. At what point does equipment stop assisting a skill and start replacing it? Every sport that uses handheld equipment eventually has to answer that question, usually quietly, usually through a technical committee nobody outside the sport ever hears from. Bowling answered it twice, in 2 different ways, in the same calendar year, through 2 different organizations that govern overlapping pools of the same athletes. Here is where the jurisdiction split, and the date matters. Beginning January 1st, 2023, the Professional Bowlers Association prohibited wrist supports built from steel, plastic, or comparable rigid materials, on the grounds that these devices effectively immobilize the wrist. Tape remained legal. Flexible supports remained legal. The prohibition applied specifically to PBA Tour competition, the level of the sport with the most television exposure and the most prize money on the table. Outside that tour, the picture changes. Many USBC certified leagues across the country continued to permit the same category of device. Local and regional tournaments, sanctioned under a different rulebook, allowed bowlers to use equipment the PBA had just labeled a threat to competitive integrity at the national tour level. Nothing about the glove changed between those 2 rulebooks. The plastic is the same plastic. The steel is the same steel. The wrist mechanics inside it do not know which league it is competing in. Only the jurisdiction changed. The object crossed an invisible administrative line and became a different kind of object, legally speaking, without a single physical modification taking place. That contradiction deserves a closer look, because contradictions are where institutions tell you what they actually believe, as opposed to what they say in a press release. If a piece of equipment fundamentally undermines fair competition, that should be true everywhere it is used. Wrist mechanics do not change because a bowler is competing for a regional title instead of a national one. The body performs the same motion in both buildings. Either the device creates an unfair advantage, or it does not. The PBA'S rule assumes the first answer. The continued legality elsewhere assumes the second. Both cannot be correct at the same time, in the same sport, governed by overlapping organizations regulating the same pool of competitors. So look for the evidence that resolved that contradiction in the PBA's favor. There isn't one, not publicly. The PBA's stated rationale, on the record, centers on preserving what it calls the athletic requirement of maintaining wrist position through delivery. That is a principle. It is not a study. No comprehensive performance data was released showing how many additional strikes a rigid wrist support produces over a season. No comparative analysis of titles won by bowlers using these devices versus bowlers who did not. No measurement of scoring differential at all in any public document attached to this rule. The public was given a conclusion. The public was not given the evidence behind the conclusion. That is not the same as saying no evidence exists. It is saying that if it exists, nobody outside the organization has seen it, and the rule went into effect anyway, with disqualification as a possible penalty for non-compliance. The press never asked. No outlet covering competitive bowling filed a records request for the data behind the 2023 rule change. No trade publication asked the PBA to produce the study, if one exists, that quantified the advantage these devices created. The rule was reported as a fact. It was not reported as a claim requiring substantiation. A wire story ran. A few bowling forums debated it. Nobody with a press credential asked the organization to show its work. That gap between announcement and verification is where this story actually lives. And it is a gap that exists by omission, not by concealment, which in some ways is worse, because it means nobody even had to hide anything. Now look at who writes these rules in the first place. The United States Bowling Congress, the body that certifies the leagues where rigid wrist supports often remain legal, has had executive leadership drawn directly from equipment manufacturing. Executive Director Chad Murphy's career, prior to USBC leadership, included product management and research and development positions tied to Columbia Industries, Columbia 300, and Ebonite International. Companies that design, manufacture, and sell the same category of bowling equipment, the organization he leads is responsible for regulating. To be precise about what is and is not being alleged here, there is no evidence of personal misconduct in that career history. Nobody is accused of taking a bribe. Nobody is accused of writing a rule to specifically benefit a former employer. None of that is the claim, and a careful investigator does not need that claim to make the point land. The claim is structural. When the people who write equipment rules have spent their careers inside the companies that manufacture the equipment, the regulatory body and the regulated industry are not separate institutions checking each other. They are the same small professional world, wearing two different hats depending on the calendar year. That arrangement does not require corruption to produce outcomes that look, from the outside, indistinguishable from regulatory capture. It only requires familiarity, shared assumptions, and a revolving door that nobody on either side considers unusual because it has always worked that way. This is not the first time bowling's governing bodies have drawn a line only after a product already had a foothold in the market. In 2022, the USBC excluded 6 bowling ball models from national tournament competition, while those same models remained approved for use in most other sanctioned play. The restriction specifically affecting certain Purple Hammer bowling balls arrived years after those products had already entered the market, built a customer base, and established commercial success across multiple seasons of competitive play. In several of these cases, the restrictions came bundled with grandfathering provisions, narrow rules that let existing inventory and existing competitors continue under the old standard, even as the new standard supposedly addressed a fairness problem urgent enough to require a rule change at all. A genuine fairness emergency does not usually come with a grace period for the people already benefiting from the unfair advantage. Look at the order of operations. The product enters the market. The product succeeds. Competitors purchase it, adopt it, build their game around it, win with it. Only then does a governing body decide the product requires restriction. That is not how a fairness-driven regulator behaves if its primary concern is the integrity of competition from the outset. That is how a regulator behaves when its primary concern is managing a transition after the market has already moved without it. The wrist support story fits that same shape almost exactly. A product sells for years under brand names with established reputations. It builds a user base across multiple levels of competition. Then, at one specific tier, the tier with the cameras, the tier with the largest prize purses, a rule appears with an effective date and a penalty schedule attached. The USBC never investigated whether that same pattern applied to its own decisions on the wrist support question, at least not in any document released to the public. If an internal review exists weighing why the PBA'S National Tour rule was not mirrored at the USBC's sanctioned level, That review has not surfaced. If the two organizations ever discussed harmonizing their equipment standards, that discussion has left no public trace either. Here is the contradiction stated plainly, because it deserves to be stated plainly more than once. A rigid wrist support can be banned for one event and worn legally at another, despite being the identical physical object in both settings. If the equipment fundamentally undermines competitive integrity, allowing it to remain legal anywhere becomes very difficult to justify. If it does not fundamentally undermine integrity, banning it nationally, with penalties up to disqualification, requires a stronger evidentiary basis than what has been made public. Bowling cannot have it both ways. Right now, on paper, it does. That contradiction should redirect your attention, not toward the glove, toward the process that produced a rule about the glove. If you want to follow that investigation, subscribe to Strikeline Bowling. Every video we make is part of it. This was one story. Strikeline Bowling digs up another one every week. Subscribe. The public record on this rule is heavy on decisions and light on analysis. The PBA announced a prohibition. It established consequences, a warning system, and disqualification for repeat use. What it did not do publicly is release a comprehensive study supporting that prohibition. That detail carries a flag in the source record itself, marked for verification, because no comprehensive advantage study tied to this rule has been confirmed in the documentary record currently available to anyone outside the organization. Participants were told the outcome. Spectators were told the outcome. Neither group received the underlying analysis that supposedly justified it. That is not a process failure unique to bowling. It is a pattern visible across institutions that prefer the appearance of certainty to the discomfort of showing their work. Bowling's governing bodies are simply a small, low-profile example of a behavior that exists everywhere. Regulation touches commerce, finance, pharmaceuticals, food labeling. The size of the industry changes. The shape of the behavior does not. The PBA never commented beyond its original public statement when later asked, by anyone tracking this rule, to clarify what evidence informed it. The original press release stands alone. No follow-up data, no technical appendix, no named study, no named researcher, no named methodology. Step back from the glove entirely for a moment. Most people who hear about an illegal bowling glove assume there is a device out there that mechanically guarantees strikes, something so powerful regulators had no choice but to ban it everywhere. The documentary record shows something far less dramatic and far more revealing. It shows a single category of equipment treated inconsistently depending on which organization is running the event and which level of competition is being protected from public scrutiny. The real unanswered question was never whether wrist supports help a bowler's release. They were engineered to do exactly that, and the manufacturers say so openly in their own marketing materials in language no regulator has disputed. The real unanswered question is how an institution decides where assistance ends and substitution begins, and why two governing bodies overseeing the same sport reached two different answers without ever publicly reconciling them with each other. The PBA's 2023 wrist support rule and the USBC's 2022 equipment exclusions are not officially connected to each other anywhere in the record. No press release from either organization references the other's decision. No joint statement addresses why one body restricted certain balls years after commercial success, while the other restricted certain gloves at a moment when those gloves had already been on the market for years under established, recognizable brand names. The two events sit beside each other on the public record. They have never been joined. That absence of connection is itself information. It is hidden in plain sight, available to anyone willing to compare. Two press releases side by side and notice that the underlying behavior, restrict after adoption, announce without releasing supporting data, staff leadership from inside the regulated industry, repeats itself almost exactly year after year, organization after organization. None of that is wrong, but it's incomplete. A rule restricting equipment is not inherently suspicious. Regulatory bodies are entitled to update standards as a sport evolves. Executives are entitled to careers that span both industry and governance. Plenty of regulatory frameworks operate that way without producing scandal. Grandfathering provisions are a normal mechanism for managing transitions fairly, used across countless industries for reasons that have nothing to do with concealment. Each individual fact, taken alone, has an innocent explanation readily available, and a fair investigator names that explanation rather than pretending it doesn't exist. What the innocent explanation does not account for is the accumulation. Restriction after market success, not before it. Decisions announced without the data behind them. Leadership drawn from the regulated industry itself, repeatedly, across multiple administrations. A rule that applies in one building and not in the one next door, governing the identical object, with no public document explaining the discrepancy between them. Each piece alone is forgivable. Assembled in sequence, they describe an institution that moves to protect appearances only once a pattern has already become visible to outsiders, and even then, only partially, and only at the tier where the cameras are watching, and only with a level of detail thin enough to avoid any real follow-up. The spine of this story is simple enough to state in 2 sentences. A rigid wrist support remains legal in many bowling competitions,